Okay, thanks for joining me. My name's Spencer Carley, and today I'll be talking about using Meteor as a backend exclusively. And before I get started, I just want to do a brief intro of who I am. Like I said before, my name's Spencer. I've been a developer with Differential. Differential is a development company that uh, helps companies remove barriers to growth, and we oftentimes do that through software development. And with that, I've been using React Native for the last year and a half, basically very shortly after the public release of it. And before then and since then, I've been using Meteor, totaling up for about 3 years full time now. And that's kind of my background and my experiences and where I actually came up with the topic for this talk. So, quick overview of what this presentation is actually going to be. First off, for anyone new to Meteor, we're just going to do a very brief intro to what Meteor is. Afterwards, we'll cover some benefits and drawbacks of Meteor, of the way it's actually built. We'll cover some instances where you may only want to use Meteor on the server so that you don't want to use the client-side pieces of it. And then finally, I want to show you some examples of how you can interface with the Meteor server when you're using a client that isn't the kind of official Meteor client. So with that, let's dive right in. So first off, what is Meteor? Well, Meteor is a fast way to build JavaScript apps. It covers the entire stack. It's got server, the web, so in your browser, and then you can also tack on mobile, which is built via Cordova. Included in that is the database. It uses MongoDB for that, which is a NoSQL database, and that works really well for the real-time pieces, which I'll talk about in a second. And then finally, this is kind of one of the bigger movements away from more traditional frameworks. Is it's using WebSockets it's using DDP protocol via WebSockets rather than something like REST. So in a traditional sense, your client is constantly connected to the server via WebSockets, and then it's transmitting data back and forth between client and server via DDP. DDP stands for Distributed Data Protocol, if you're interested in that. So what are some benefits of Meteor? Well, the first thing is it's very quick to get started with. Since it's a Meteor meetup, I'll kind of assume people are somewhat familiar with Meteor, but basically you can say Meteor create my app and you're good to go. You've got a web app, you've got the server, they're talking to each other, and it's really, really awesome. It's amazing how fast you can get started with. And then on top of that, you can get user accounts for free. I think it's just Meteor add accounts password, Meteor add accounts OAuth, Google. I'm not sure what those commands are exactly, but with one command in your terminal, you've got a full app. One more, you've got user accounts using email and password. One more, you can use numerous OAuth providers that are built in. And then, and all of this is actually built on top of MongoDB, which it's great because it's super, super flexible. You don't have to worry about writing migrations like you would on a SQL database when you make updates, when you add a user account or whatever. So that's one of those, and it works really well with the stack. As I say in the next point, Meteor's real-time by default, and that's using the Meteor PubSub system. So Meteor PubSub is actually built over the DDP protocol, or just DDP. And so the great thing about that is, if you got kind of an interface where the user expects, constant updates. Say it's a chat application. You want that to be real time. You don't want the user to have to go and refresh their data or have to refresh their browser to get the new data. You just want that sent down there. And Meteor does things like that really, really well. And MongoDB helps enable that. Just the way it's built, the way Meteor listens to it. And that's starts to go behind the scenes, but that just gives you an idea of some of those benefits with Meteor. So with every benefit, there's some sort of drawback. Meteor is awesome to get started with. one command, you're off to the races. You can build your app then. But with that, Meteor is a very big tool. Since it's full stack, it's touching your server, your database, it's touching your web app, your mobile app if you choose to go that route. So it's touching a lot of things. There's a great team there, but you're kind of at their mercy to make sure it's maintained well and that things are all going to work the way you expect them. Again, looking at kind of the full stack component, traditionally you have to buy into Meteor entirely. You can't just do it incrementally. So that's definitely a drawback, especially to new teams that might be excited about what Meteor is doing or what Meteor is capable of, but they have an existing app that they can't just drop that and rebuild it with Meteor. And then finally, I've got real-time by default. It's both a benefit and a drawback. Working with Meteor over these last 3 years, I've seen oftentimes the real-time component is overused. Or it's maybe not overused, but it's not thought through completely by developers, because it is really, really awesome by default. And, just to say everything's real time, it sounds cool, but there are drawbacks to that. On the server side, there's going to be, it's a little bit more expensive because the server is keeping track of what that client state is. And if you've got 1,000 connected clients, the server's got to be aware of 1,000 different clients, data that they have on their device. So that can be a drawback, but most of the time I view the real-time by default in Meteor as a benefit. Especially when I was getting started, it was really cool. Because before that I had just, worked with things like WordPress. But anyways, I digress. Let's keep moving. So now that we've got kind of a basic idea of Meteor, and we know that it can cover the entire stack. When would you want to use Meteor purely as your backend? So Meteor would just be touching the server and the database side of things. Oops, jump forward a slide. Okay. So first case is if you want to build a native mobile app. I mentioned before that Meteor can handle the web side of things, the mobile side of things, but that's via Cordova. And Cordova does that via a web view on the device, and that's not going to allow you to tap into the native pieces of a mobile app that kind of make that experience unique to the platform and just really performant. So, that's one case. Or you want to build your new app in Objective-C/Swift for iOS or Java for Android, be it performance reasons, or that's just what your existing team is familiar with. Another possibility is if you've got that existing app, if you have an existing app but you've built it on top of a backend as a service such as what's formerly known as Parse.com or Firebase, those types of things, and you want to kind of transition to managing your own data. In which case, your mobile app it's working for you. It's your backend that isn't. So that might be an instance where you want to transition to Meteor. Another side is just tooling preference. There's a lot of great front end tools. Webpack now, or in the past, or I guess still now, Grunt, Gulp, all these different tools out there, and typically these are more efficient than Meteor. They're very focused. They've got a team, a community focused on one thing, and that's the tool around it, versus Meteor, where it's got to focus on the server, the database, different clients. So there's benefit to having a focused tool with a focused community around that. And oftentimes with that, there's more flexibility, the community is stronger, and then you also need to consider, you might be more familiar with those tools, and that's okay to want to continue to use those, versus trying to learn a whole bunch of new tools on top of wanting to build this new app, this new company, whatever it may be. And then finally, because I'm just, I'm very much into React Native. I love what I've been able to do as a web developer, building mobile apps. But in reality, like, React Native doesn't natively build into the Meteor build tool. So you've got to work around that somehow. But I know for me, like, I still want to use all those incredible benefits of React Native. And as I say here, like, this is how I've been using Meteor for the last year and a half since I started using React Native. I haven't really built much for the web, but I still use Meteor on the daily basis. Okay, so we've talked about what Meteor is, instances where Meteor may only work or make sense for your case as a backend. What are the routes we can actually go about using this? Let's dive into them. So the three primary ones that I've got experience with, minus Apollo / GraphQL. I haven't actually gotten to dive into that code too much, but some of my coworkers very much into it. So go through and just cover the different instances. So first up is DDP, which again is the Distributed Data Protocol. And if you want to use DDP, which is kind of the Meteor way, air quotes there, but on that front, you can use pub sub and methods. So the pub sub or publication subscription model is the server's going to publish some data and the client can go ahead and subscribe to that. And the way Meteor works is that is going to automatically be an updating data source. So, once you make that publication, that subscription, that data is going to be passed and forth over DDP in real time. And then the other side is methods. Methods are kind of a, call once, get the result, whatever it may be. Very much like a traditional REST endpoint. So, you can just say meteor.call my data, and you'll get that response. And you're in charge of handling what to do with that response. So let's jump into some code examples for this. Hopefully it's easy to read and clear enough, but in the top left, you can see what it's like to do a publication in Meteor. So we're just saying meteor.publish posts, and then from there we're returning our post.find, which if you're not familiar with Mongo, that's just that'll return a Mongo cursor. And DDP is kind of aware of what to do at this point. I don't want to dive into all of that, but basically it's going to send as little data to that connected client as it possibly can so they can have an accurate representation of the data that they request and that they kind of expect. And that'll just keep updating. So if a new post is added to that collection as a client is subscribed to the post's publication, that'll show up on any client that's subscribed to posts. The other example in the bottom right is if you want to do the same thing but with a Meteor method. So here we've got our post.all method, and you can see the difference here is instead of returning a cursor, we're actually going to return an array, which is what that dot fetch is doing. Unlike the publication, when the data is returned from post.all, it's just an array. The server knows nothing about it. After that point, it's sending that data off, and that's the end of the server's responsibility at this point. In this instance where it's just reading data. So that's the server side. What's it going to look like on the client? And since I'm familiar with React Native, this is what I do on a day-to-day basis. I'm going to use React Native as an example here. So with that, the library I use when building a Meteor-backed React Native app is React Native Meteor. And the author has worked really, really hard to build API parity between this React Native Meteor library and the actual Meteor tool. So with that, if you're familiar with Meteor, this is going to look really familiar. actually, let's see if I can underline. Here you can see we've got, our subscribe, which is going to make that subscription to the publication posts. And then down here, as that data comes in, updates, we've got this meteor.collection posts.find. And then, that'll go ahead and get rid of that. Pass this down to our React component, which is kind of beyond scope of this presentation. But if you're familiar with Meteor, that's kind of the process you're going to go through in this case. And the cool thing is, like, this is going to be a React Native app. It's not, the Meteor isn't touching the client at all. And then likewise, if you want to do, if you want to use the method, when that component mounts, maybe you call post.all, and then at that point you can see, you're responsible for handling either the error or the result. Whereas in the pub sub model, you just kind of have to call that. You have to request the data you expect, and that's kind of the end of that story there. Okay, take a sip of water. So now, what about if you want to use REST? Well, there's a few ways to easily build a REST API with Meteor now, and these are all packages that you can look up on Atmosphere. There's Rest of Us, Simple REST, and then Simple JSON routes. They're just 3 different options. I'll be showing my examples using JSON routes because it's kind of it's the least magic, so we can actually go through and talk about what's going on. So yeah, first up is I'm going to be using Simple REST. So what Simple REST is going to do is actually turn your publications and your methods into REST endpoints automatically, and it'll give you a few extra options to kind of customize that. So as before, we can see after we've added the Simple REST package, we're just going to create our normal publication like you would any other, and that's you got a REST endpoint that goes along with this. Then in the bottom right, here we've got our Meteor method, and it looks pretty similar. Down here we're returning post.find.fetch. The only difference here is we're going to specify that this method is accessible via the REST verb of get. By default, I think all of the methods when using Simple REST default to using posts. So since we're using this to get data, that's what we have to do here. So with that, those publications, those methods, those are defaulting to, or we're automatically going to get some REST endpoints for those. So say we want to get our posts via the publication, we're just making this request, and this is all outlined in the Simple REST documentation. But you can see that we make our fetch. React Native has the fetch API built right into it, so obviously going to use that because of how simple it is. We go ahead, fetch our data, and much like we saw in the previous example where you're using meteor.call, where at that point we have to handle, if there's an error, we have to manage that, and then we also have to manage what happens when the data is returned. And here you can just kind of see the format of how data is returned from the publication. So in this case, since it was posts that we're returning, we'll just say data.post, and that's the data we're interested in this case. And likewise, the method is the exact same, minus me making a little typo. But you can see here it's prefixed by methods, and then this should have been posts.all. And then again, we're just, in this case, rather than having to specify the exact collection name, since we're 100% in charge of this Meteor method, all we have to do to pass on to the state of our component is the data that is actually returned from the endpoint. Okay, so that's DDP, that's REST. Those are the two that I have used the most in the last year and a half. But kind of looking forward, what can we expect if you've been involved with Meteor for any amount of time, or maybe you've seen on the forums or whatever? There's been a huge investment by the Meteor development group into Apollo, which is built on top of GraphQL. And the great thing here is just the flexibility of it. I talked about before that Meteor is kind of a big tool. Fortunately for Apollo, this is just going to handle the data transport between the client and the server. And the great thing there is that we can get data from different sources, be it our Meteor app, an external REST endpoint, SQL database. It's wherever we want to get the data from. For me, though, the great thing there is, we can get the data from our Meteor app. And with that, we can use whatever tools we want versus having to buy into 100% of Meteor. And then for those people who already have an app, it's incrementally adoptable. You can keep your REST endpoints, you can keep your Meteor methods, your Meteor publications, and slowly start to transition to GraphQL endpoints. It's efficient, so this is something with GraphQL. You're only going to request the data you need, and the server, is going to kind of respect that and only send the data you need, which is great over mobile connections. You're not sending unnecessary data, which is going to use up your client's bandwidth and also just make your app slower. It's going to take longer for data to get there. And then also GraphQL, it's kind of inherently backwards compatible because you're only ever making a request against one endpoint. And then, based off the data that you send to that endpoint, it'll know what to send back to the client. And that's great for mobile because you can kind of support multiple different versions of your app over time without having to update endpoints that might, hopefully they won't, but they might, break an older client that hasn't updated. So it's kind of a very heavy screen, but I'll try to walk through this, and hopefully I didn't make any typos in the code here. And one thing I want to say is, this may seem like overkill for a very basic app, and I won't disagree with you. But if you're going to work on an app for 6 months, 6 years, build a company that's going to just keep going, this is likely going to make a lot of sense because of all the benefits that you're getting. But we can see down here at the bottom, we're just setting up this GraphQL server, and there's a lot here, and in all honesty, I'm still trying to get a grasp on all of this, but you can see that we're setting up our single endpoint, which is going to be this GraphQL endpoint. And then, as I'll cover in the next slide, we'll see what kind of requests we make against it. But we can see up here we've got what's called a resolver, and that's just going to kind of resolve the data that's being requested. And then this line, very familiar to what we saw in the publications, the methods, all of that. We're just returning an array of data from our database. And then down here is a schema. If you're familiar with GraphQL, that's going to make sense. When you kind of go down this route, it'll start to make more sense. But that's just kind of how we define how the GraphQL endpoint knows what to expect and how to actually resolve that information. So that's the server side of things to kind of get data. And then if you're making, this request from, in my case, React Native app, you can just go ahead, pass in this different information. We're going to query the database and tell it that we want all posts. And then inside of that, the data that we want posts, and we'll want the ID and title from the database back. Say there's also the body of the post, but we're not interested in that right now. Say it's just, a list of posts. And we don't need to send the data for 50 blog posts to the client yet because they're only going to click through and read one at this point. So that's great on this side. And say your UI changes at some point, it's easy to go ahead and update this. But again, the client's only ever going to request the data that it needs. without having to change the endpoint they're updating. Hopefully I'm doing a decent job explaining that. And I apologize if I'm getting things wrong to anyone who's a bit more seasoned in GraphQL or Apollo. So yeah, just quick review. So if you need real time, or you think DDP is like an incredible thing, it's easy to do so if you want to use Meteor as a backend and some different client for the web, a mobile app, a TV app. You just need to find the client library that supports DDP, or you can just go ahead and learn it and build that library yourself. Or if you're using some sort of traditional client and you want to use something, or you want to use something you're more comfortable with, that you've used in your job before, that you've built with, it's easy to make REST endpoints with Meteor, especially if you've used PubSub in the past or Meteor methods. You can add one package and those endpoints are going to be there automatically for you. And then finally, if you're someone really invested in the future, you've got some free time on your hand and you want to learn something else, Apollo or just raw GraphQL, but Apollo is definitely going to make this easier for you. That's definitely where, my eyes are at. A lot of other people, especially in the Meteor community, are looking at. Apollo's, it's really powerful what they've got going on there. So yeah, I hope you all enjoyed that. If you want to reach me, you can hit me up, Spencer_Carly on Twitter. I write almost weekly on Medium about React Native and Meteor and just kind of my experiences building with it and learning with it, and I try my best to share that. So I thank you all for your time, and I hope you enjoyed.